ahead and get started since it's 2 o'clock. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Yelena Subasic with Dean Dorton. Welcome to our June CloudBytes, which will be tips and tricks on Sage Intacct's user-defined book. Tabitha Schmaltz will be presenting today. We're glad to have you guys on. This will be a good session. Just a couple of housekeeping things. This session will be recorded, and typically we do send the recording out, and it will be posted onto our website and social media, so keep an eye out for that. And then also, if at any point during the presentation you have questions, there is a Q&A area and a little chat section kind of at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, feel free to type it up, and we have some time at the end of the webinar allotted for questions. So don't be afraid to ask anything. That's kind of all I have. And with that, Tabitha, I will let you start.
Great, thank you, Yelena. Hi, for those of you that haven't had a chance to meet me yet, my name is Tabitha Schmaltz. I've been at Dean Dorton for a few years now, and today I have the pleasure of talking with you about different ways that we can use Sage Intacct's user-defined books. There we go. All right, so our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about how Sage Intacct utilizes the multi-book architecture and what that actually means. We're going to also talk about who actually has access to user-defined books and the power of being able to utilize those books to do what Intacct calls book stacking. We also have a few use cases that we'll discuss on how we can use book stacking to make your life easier, and then what we can do with those books to do some really good reporting. And as Yelena said, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to go ahead and type those up and drop them into the chat, and we'll go ahead and get to all the questions at the end of the session. So some of you may never have heard of a user-defined book. You're not sure what that is. This is the first time you've ever heard of a user-defined book, or sometimes dubbed a UDB. So you might be wondering, what is a user-defined book? So the user-defined books are custom reporting books that we use in order to create additional reporting scenarios. These typically happen outside of our standard operational books. So these are not your accrual books, your cash books. They typically are a little bit more flexible. So if you have an accrual book or a cash book and you want to also have an additional book that might have a different reporting standard, like maybe it's IFRS or GAAP, you maybe have some industry-specific reporting needs, you might actually find a really strong need or a use case for that user-defined book. So let's take a look at what that actually means. So Intacct has a multi-book architecture. So what this does is it allows us to stack multiple books. This graphic kind of gives you an idea of we're keeping additional books, but not in a sense that we're having to actually create the entire ledger all over again. We actually can overlap them, and we start to stack them together to produce a different type of financial reporting. So for example, we can start with our accrual book, and then we can add in additional user-defined books to show a combined perspective of these books combined. So if you have that accrual book, you might have enabled a GAAP book, which GAAP, by the way, is not a user-defined book per se, but it does behave like one. And this is a setting inside of our general ledger settings. But you can combine those two with your user-defined books for maybe something like committed spend or allocations, maybe elimination entries, depending on your setup. And when we stack all those books together, we can get reporting that is all combined all at once at one point. We can pick and choose which books we'd like to include. This is not an all or nothing. It's actually more of a more dynamic selection based on current needs or reporting needs for that moment. So again, you can stack one, well, you wouldn't stack one, but you could stack 2 or 3 books independently, and you can just keep adding to that. So why would we choose to use a user-defined book? Well, they have some really great features. First of all, they're really easy to set up. We'll go ahead and walk through the setup of a user-defined book in just a moment. There currently are no limits inside of Intacct for how many user-defined books we can create, so we can actually create as many as our needs exist. The best practice, though, is to just limit our user-defined books to what we are willing to actually actively manage, because when we are doing our reporting, we'll have to select from that list. So while the sky is the limit, do try to be a little conservative and approach it in that direction. Also, because these are books that are overlaying your existing books, you will use an identical chart of accounts. We don't have to try to do any kind of mapping. They quite literally will use your existing chart of accounts and dimension structures. Each book also will have its own set of journal entries. So the nice thing about that is that when you create a journal entry in the system, you're actually posting those journal entries to a journal specifically for those user-defined books. And each user-defined book will have its own set of journal entries, and we're able to keep those segmented and very easy to identify. When we're creating financial reports that utilize those user-defined books as well, we are able to designate by individual column which books we're actually using. And we're going to show an example of that a little later on in our demo. But we can actually look at one report, and each column could actually be reflecting a different book, if you will, which will allow us to have a lot more flexibility in reporting. Also, we are able to make some changes to how we would normally see general ledger reports or even custom reports by utilizing those user-defined book features. So how do we actually set them up? I just got through telling you they're really simple to do. I'm going to walk through some screenshots of how we would set this up, and then later when we get into a demo, I will walk you through what those screens look like in the live environment. But when we go to set up a user-defined book, there basically are 3 steps. So the first is that we are going to identify what user-defined books that we'd like, and that we actually do need a user-defined book, so we will enable that user-defined book. Then we will be granting the users permissions to access those books, and then finally we'll add the journals so that way we could create those journal entries to the same user-defined books. Once we have enabled the user-defined book, we'll have 3 lines of permissions that we'll be enabling. These are going to allow the users to be able to see the user-defined books, to see the journals themselves, and also to be able to perform those user-defined journal entries. In addition, once we've set up those books, we need to set up the user-defined journals for the books. If you or your client is using purchasing or order entry, another step that you will need to do is you will need to go into those transaction definitions and be sure that you are updating those as well to be able to accommodate your user-defined books. One note that you do want to take is that once you have entered transactions into a user-defined book, you cannot disable that user-defined book. In order to get rid of the user-defined book, if you determine it's no longer needed or not something that you want in the system, you would have to delete the journal entries transactions out. And then once there's no more journal entries, then you can delete the user-defined book. So you basically are going through the process in reverse. You're kind of unzipping, if you will, to get those out of the way. So making the assumption that you have administration or admin access, some of these screens will look really familiar to you. If you are not, you don't see some of these options, your permissions may be a little bit different. So what you'll want to do in order to set up your user-defined books and to access the permissions to update the subscriptions, you're going to go into your subscription setting. The path for this is going that company, admin, subscription, and then general ledger, and there's a little hyperlink to configure. And then once you are in the configuration screen, you'll want to scroll down and look for that Enable User-Defined Books checkmark. This is underneath the Advanced GL options. and you're going to want to enable that box there. Again, if you do not see this option, your permissions may be limited, so you'll want to reach out to your Intacct administrator or Dorton support for assistance. Next, you're going to go into your permissions. So depending on whether you are using role-based or user-based permissions, you'll want to select the appropriate user or the appropriate role and update, so that way these users are able to access the user-defined books. Now, one thing to note when you're adding the permissions, the rights to specifically keep a business user from being able to enter the journal entries in the user-defined books exist. So we can come in and we can say they are able to add a user-defined journal entry, as you can see right there in that top highlighted box. However, if they are a business user that does have access to the general ledger, they're still going to be able to access the information when they're running the report on the GL. So if your user-defined book contains confidential information, maybe you're putting confidential information into that user-defined book, you will want to also still consider who can see information that is posted to the general ledger, because they may or may not be able to see that as well, just depending on how you set up those books. Next, we would be going in to set up the actual book itself. So in order to do this, you're going to go again into your general ledger drop downs. You'll select the plus next to the user-defined books, which is on the Setup tab, and you'll be able to add your book information there. Again, we recommend choosing a book ID that makes it super simple for you to identify which book is which while you're selecting them on your reporting. And that description does do a good job of giving you some additional information as to what that book is for. You may be creating several books, so it's important to make sure that those descriptions are descriptive and not super generic. So we kind of already went over this. Actually, these are the journals. I apologize. So then we're going to go into the journals. This is also on the general ledger. So you're going to go into the setup again, but this time on the journals, which is going to be in the leftmost column, you'll find a new option for user-defined journals. If you just recently gave yourself permissions for this, you will want to refresh your screen to get that user-defined journal pop up on there. Go ahead and click the plus, and you'll add a user-defined journal that will match to the user-defined book. So you can see here in the pop-up, while we've created the symbol for our journal and given it a title, we can also see that there is a user-defined book identified. So in this specific case, we've identified that the book we created in the last step, this is the journal that will match all the journal entries specifically to that book. Next, when we are ready to actually enter our journal entries to populate our user-defined book, we'll do that through the journal entry step. So on our general ledger, on the All tab, there'll be a user-defined underneath our journal entries. You'll go ahead and click the plus to add journal entries to your user-defined books. So just to reiterate that, if you're entering a journal entry onto your normal journal entry screens or onto your adjusting journal entry screens, those will not post to your user-defined books, and so you will have to use a separate journal entry. So once you are populating that journal entry, you could see that you do populate that journal. We'll go ahead and take a look at that in the live environment once we're there. But other than selecting the journal that is identified for your user-defined books, the journal entry screen is going to feel very familiar. So you'll still be able to enter your journal entry just as you would in any other journal entry. So as I mentioned, the journal entry will feel very familiar. All of the dimensions that you have set up in the system that are normally accessible from your general ledger journal entry screen will still be available here. If you have a lot of journal entry components that you're wanting to populate into your user-defined book, you can still do this through an import. So the import would be the same that we use for a general journal entry import, which is found under company and import company data. You'll just want to make sure that you are selecting that user-defined book when you are populating which journal your journal entry should post to. Now, this last point here says, depending on the setup, we can post to a closed period, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, unless we specifically select that these are going to be part of our management reporting books, and I'll show you that in a moment, the books will behave as all of your other journal entries and your general books, your accrual or cash books, where you only post to open periods. So now we have data in the system for those user-defined books, but what can we actually do with it? So let's take a look. So we're going back to that concept of book stacking. So with book stacking, we're essentially putting our financial data into several different silos that we're going to combine in various ways for various purposes. Okay, so remember as we go through this that we're not choosing specific journals, like we're not choosing our user-defined journal or our accounts payable journal or our general journal. We're instead choosing the entire book to combine. Okay, so I have some examples here of some of the types of books. We might have our normal accrual books, some gap adjustments, committed spend allocations, eliminations, just different ways that we might be siloing some data. Now let's take a look at some of those combinations that might exist. So if you're an auditor or if you are being audited and you need to produce some reports for your auditor, you might decide that you want to combine your accrual book with the gap adjustment book, and that would help you to provide those gap financials when those reports are requested. If you have outside reporting requirements, also still could be an auditor, maybe there's some eliminations that are going on in your organization, you could combine your eliminations book in addition to that accrual book and also to that gap adjusting journal entry book. Now, you also might have some types of management reporting. So you may decide that you want to take your accrual book, your user-defined book for commitments, and maybe your user-defined book for allocations. Okay. Sometimes you have gap adjustments that your management report should not include, so we can still create that separate book for those adjustments and exclude them from this reporting. So this is one of the reasons that we might be stacking multiple books, and again, why it's really important to name them so it's easy to add to those reports and you know what you're selecting when you do that. So when we have those books in the reports, we're going to go through this in the demo in just a minute, but you get to choose which books are going to be coming into the system and whether they're going to be included with your accrual or cash book. So you can actually choose to look at just the transactions that are inside of your user-defined books without actually adding them to your accrual or your cash books. So you have options. You're going to be selecting those in your columns tab. So again, you can have columns that are looking at just one book or at multiple books. And you can determine at that point if you'd like them to be combined with anything else. All right, so let's talk about some use cases for user-defined books. Maybe you're sitting there saying, okay, I kind of am getting it a little bit, but when would I possibly use user-defined books? So these are a few ways that you might elect to use a user-defined book in your organization. I'm sure that we could sit down and talk. You might have another idea of a need. We're happy to help explore those with you and determine the right way to use a user-defined book for your specific setup. But these are just a few ideas. In the case of accrual to cash adjustments, this one's a great alternative if maybe you haven't set up cash books, or maybe you have or your client has messed up their cash books and they kind of get a little bit messy. Using a user-defined book is a great way to help clean that up. But maybe you have some of these other suggestions, like maybe we have some company structure changes where we have acquired another organization and we want to keep track of maybe some of their history where we don't want it to actually be in our books, but we would like to be able to keep track of it for comparative reporting. We could have eliminations. There could be test entries that we want to just see how it affects our books if we make these entries a certain way, or even recording like payroll in detail format as opposed to in a lump sum. So speaking of the payroll use case, so here's an example how a company might decide to use a user-defined book for like a payroll breakout. So if we have payroll, we might accrue all of our payroll in like just a single personnel department. So we can use a user-defined book to actually detail that out. So we can spread out the detail by department, and that's helpful if like there's two assumptions here. The first is that we can create a single user-defined book that if we're not reallocating anything back to a personnel department, we might just go ahead and split it out, and I'll show you what this looks like in just a second. But we also could have two user-defined books, maybe one that we accrue the payroll, and then we do a reversal of that payroll in one user-defined book, and then we do a second user-defined book to spread the payroll information out. So when our normal reporting comes out, our accrual books, maybe all of our payroll is assigned to one department, just a payroll overhead. But we are able to utilize user-defined books in order to break out all of the payroll costs into individual departments, which is really helpful if you want to know how much payroll was actually spent on sales or how much was spent in your IT department, especially in smaller organizations where there might only be one or two individuals in those departments. Having the payroll cost associated with that becomes very transparent. So some organizations like to utilize a user-defined book to kind of put that behind the scenes and be able to use it on management reporting and not in the general ledger. Some other suggestions here, you can use them for test entries. We kind of mentioned seeing how different journal entries or different transactions might affect what your overall reporting looks like. So you can kind of use them as like a quasi sandbox. You're not essentially utilizing them as a true sandbox, but just for some journal entries and being able to review some financials. The grantee reporting here, sometimes organizations send out grants and they want to see on the reporting they want to see on one set of reporting the grant expense, but then they also want to see in some of their management reporting maybe how those funds are actually being used, and so they can utilize a user-defined book to help provide more information for management to be able to review. Eliminations, if you have a need for eliminations to be performed, but you do not want to utilize a new entity to be able to do that, some organizations have elected to use an eliminations user-defined book. And then we talked again about accrual to cash. So if you are set up as an accrual company with accrual-based books, and you might want to set up a separate user-defined book to be able to enter those cash adjustments. You can reverse those adjustments every month or annually based on your schedule. And then we'd be able to utilize that book stacking by combining our accrual and our cash user-defined book to provide those cash-based financials. All right, so I mentioned a little bit earlier about management reporting, and this would be one of those situations where you possibly could open up a door to being able to do a little bit more with user-defined books than you can in your general books. So when we set up our book, there was a box that says management reporting. And at the time we said, we'll just talk about it in just a moment. But what is that management reporting piece there? That's a newer feature. Basically, by saying that this is a management reporting book, in a nutshell, we're basically saying that this book has been created to allow posts to be posted into it at any time. So even if a period has been closed, we can still post into a management reporting book, even in a closed period. Okay. Now, these books, again, are still user-defined books, so it won't actually have any kind of impact to your cash or accrual basis. So it does basically help to protect your subledger because you are able to post information into a prior period without actually changing your AP, AR, cash. So that's really helpful. Once you've posted those transactions into those books, again, you can't uncheck or if you left it blank, you can't check it once you've posted into those books. So it is a decision you do need to make from the beginning. Another thing to note about management reporting books is that you cannot use them right now for purchasing or order entry transactions, although it would be kind of nice to do that for outstanding orders, like if you have commitments and you want to report them in prior months or something like that. I have been told it's on the enhancement list, but as of right now, there isn't a set date to release that. So why would we possibly use management reporting books? Well, here's a couple examples that might help. First is a change in company structures. So if you have, maybe an acquisition we talked about earlier, and you want to record some history, but you just want to keep track of that. You might go back and record transactions that have happened in a prior period that are normally closed, but this would allow you to put that piece of information in and be able to report on it as though it had actually happened. The other thing is out of period expenses. I'm sure that none of you have experienced this, but sometimes people turn in their expenses late. That's a great way that most of us will go and be like, well, it would have been really nice for someone to have turned in their expenses on time. But sometimes we really need to have those expenses lined up with maybe a revenue that's coming in or a project, project requirements. So by recording your out of period expenses in a management reporting book, we're able to have those expenses in the proper period, even though you've already closed your books. So here's an example with that acquisition, the acquisition example that I gave earlier and how this might work. So let's say that we create the user-defined book for the purchase of a new foundation. We purchased a foundation on 3/31/2020, and we want to record that purchase. So we would go and create a user-defined purchase reversal book. And when we do that, we'll record the reversal of the purchase. This does not have to be a management book because if we ever changed any information about the purchase, that would have to go into our normal books anyway. So no need for that. But what we would also do is create that management book for the management book for the user-defined book for the acquisition activity. So what this would do is allow us to record a beginning balance. Let's just say if this was our purchase on 3/31, it's possible that we recorded like maybe 12/31/18 as our beginning balances in this acquisition book, and then we recorded monthly activity for that acquisition for 19 and for the balance of 20. And being able to do that, we're actually able to run comparatives and see how that acquisition is doing compared to current data. So we're able to get those comparatives right away, as opposed to starting with nothing, just taking on that balance as of 3/31 when the acquisition took place. You'd have to wait a whole year to have enough data compiled into Intacct in your live production environment in order to get any of the meaningful comparative reporting. So here's just an example of how that would look. So we would have our accrual books, which would have the actual purchase, and then we would go ahead and have the acquisition books and the acquisition reversal book stacked together in order to produce our management reporting. So it wouldn't really be gap reporting, but we'd be able to utilize them for management use. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the demo environment. So I'm already inside of Intacct here. I'm just going to go ahead and take a look at some of these areas that we showed you. First, inside of our general ledger here, if we go to setup, this is where we have the user-defined books. So if I click here, I've actually created a couple user-defined books. We're going to talk about that payroll example. So you can see I have a payroll by department and a payroll reversal. So those are easily identified here. That we also have some additional books that are used for additional purposes. We've also created some journals. So here under journals, if we go to user defined, we've created specific user defined journals that are tied specifically to those books that we have created. So again, each book needs to have its own journals in order to be able to record those. Now, when we enter transaction information, if I go here under all and under journal entries, we're able to see those user-defined journal entries that would be here. So we can actually record information by each journal, and we'd be able to see any transactions that are occurring in there. So let's talk a little bit. I have a saved report here. Let's talk about how these reports look. So here under payroll details, I'm actually just going to go ahead and edit this report. These reports are just based on accounts, so it's an account report structure here. And if I go under columns, you can see we have a few here, and I've titled them so that you can easily see what books I'm using. Now, for your actual reports that you would create, you may decide that you don't want all of these books to be viewed this way. You might want to hide some of the columns, but this is just a great way so you can see how the data is being treated. So here we have our actual accrual book. So these are our standard books. I'm not doing anything different with them, just the way that they've been entered into the system. And then we have our payroll reversal. So if I scroll down here, you can see there's a reporting book, and this says that we're just using the accrual reporting book. But if I come to this column 3, we've selected accrual and the PR reversal. So if I click this edit books button here, it will tell me which books are available and which books are selected. Now, because I just want to see the reversal for this specific column, I have asked it to not include the main reporting book, to only show me what has been posted into the PR reversal. Okay, so you can see the reporting book says accrual is not included. In this column 4, we're doing our payroll by department. So again, looking at this, I've selected my payroll department book, and I have also still asked that we do not include the main reporting book. And then our final column here, column 5, is our stacked book. So in this case, I'm saying, well, I want to see what happens when I take my accrual book, I reverse out my payroll entry, and then I re-enter my payroll entry by department for purposes of reporting. So in this case, I have actually marked my accrual book to be included, and I have included both of my payroll user-defined books. So when we take a look at this, I'm actually just going to go ahead and put it on a live report. We have just 4 columns that go across here. So in our salary and wages, the situation for this might be that we have been booking all of our costs under administration in this specific demo. So we have our payroll that was run all under administration. And this is helpful because if anybody were to look at our payroll costs, they might see our total payroll, but they don't actually know how much we're paying each of the departments individually. So they can't try to figure out how much somebody is being paid. We've entered a payroll reversal into our user-defined books for that. And so this will actually reverse out that payroll entry. And then we put the payroll back in by department, and this takes that same amount and divides it out into the actual departments in which that payroll was incurred. The stack book here combines what we're seeing across each of these books. And so you can see the school administration in this specific example is left with none of the cost of payroll, and it's instead split across our other departments. Now, if I were to run my accrual financials, I would still see them in school administration, but if I want to run management reports for the individual departments to let them know their portion of the shared expense, by utilizing the stack books, we'd be able to do that. Now, one question that commonly comes up is, can I also sort by rows, rows for the user-defined books? And the answer is no. You can only do your sorting by columns. So it's just going to be by columns in this case. All right. I'm going to go ahead and jump back over to our PowerPoint. All right. So Yelena, that is the end of the demo. Do we have any questions?
Awesome. That was great, Tabitha. Nothing has come in, but I will open up the floor for questions if anyone has anything that they want to ask. And then, Tabitha, if you want to switch to the last slide, I know sometimes people think of kind of last-minute questions after these, so if at any time you need help setting anything up, you can just reach out to us at erpsupport@ddaftech.com, and one of our consultants can help you all out. So I'll give it another minute or so. Okay, this is a great one. Can I use user-defined books for forecasting?
So you likely could, I mean, just posting into a future period, but it would be a manual type of forecasting where you are still putting in the numbers in your journal entries that you're populating. I believe you could still use them for formulas on the user-defined books, but I would just say if you did use it for forecasting, it would be a very manual approach. If I come up with something better, I'll reach out to some other people and see if we have any other thoughts on that. If there is something better, I can reach out to that person and let them know.
Okay, that sounds good. And then another one just came through. It says, I have multiple companies. Can you consolidate the stacked books when doing consolidations?
That is also a good question. I believe that they are available in consolidations. Again, I'll square back up with that person also. I believe that they are available for consolidations.
Okay.
Well, and let me back up. So the consolidations, like if they're all the same currency, their consolidations are basically that they're just running reports at the top level. Absolutely. If that question is specific that they're maybe multi-currency, they're doing like global consolidations with the outside consolidation feature, my answer is maybe, and that's where I'd probably need to get a little bit more information.
Okay. And then one more, are there modules that require user-defined books?
No.
Okay.
So yeah, right now all of our books, if a module requires a book, you don't have to create a user-defined book. Those are completely optional. It is an advanced GL feature that you can enable. Right now you can do GAAP and tax basis books really simply without even utilizing the advanced GL features. But these management reporting books and the other user-defined books are basically on a as needed basis. So if you need them for your organization, we can set them up. But I don't believe that there are any modules that require them.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm not seeing anything else come in, so hopefully we just gave you guys some extra time back in your day. And again, if you think of anything, please feel free to reach out. So Tabitha, again, thank you, appreciate it, and I hope everyone else has a good rest of their week.